All right, all right, all right. Let's talk about travel. So, travel differs from transportation, and that is away from home. And of course, you can incur the same types of transportation costs when you travel, but we usually think of this as like airfare because you're traveling away from home. But certain jobs you would drive and still need to stay away from home. So a lot of this depends on what is your tax home, right? Home, the home you're thinking of, like where you live, may not necessarily be your tax home. So what is your tax home? Well, it's generally your regular place of business or post of duty, regardless of where you maintain your family home. It includes the entire city or general area in which your business or work is located. If you have more than one regular place of business, your tax home is your main place of business. If you don't have a regular or main place of business because of the nature of your work, then your tax home may be the place where you regularly live. And if you don't have a regular or main place of business and there is no place where you regularly live, you are considered an itinerant and your tax home is wherever you work. This is the worst of the outcomes because in this case, you cannot claim a travel expense deduction because you are never considered to be traveling away from home. Okay, more on away from home. Temporary assignments count as away from home. Now, more than 1 year is not considered temporary. So under IRS guidelines, employment away from home in a single location is temporary if termination is realistically expected within a year and employment actually lasts 1 year or less, unless facts indicate otherwise. Travel away from the tax home must be of such duration or nature that the round trip cannot reasonably be expected to be completed without being released from duty or otherwise stopping the performance of regular duties for sufficient time to obtain substantial sleep or rest. So that's what it means to be. So you got to ask yourself, if I travel up to Orange County, is that travel away from home from San Diego? Well, it's about a 2-hour drive back, so probably not. But if your assignment there takes you to 10, 11, 12 p.m., starting to get pretty late, boy, it's not really safe to drive home at that hour. You probably ought to stay there and rest because you need to sleep as opposed to drive unsafely. Then that's going to, now that would qualify as travel away from the tax home. Okay? So you can see that this really does surround the facts and circumstances test. So the IRS has consistently denied deductions for expenses that do not require sleep or rest, regardless of how many cities a single trip may have touched, how many miles it may have covered, or how many hours it may have consumed. The sleep or rest rule prevents a traveler from deducting expenses simply because he may travel more miles than another taxpayer when both of them are able to eat breakfast and dinner at home. Not that the breakfast and dinner at home is a rule, it's more of a rule of thumb, if you will. The IRS has ruled that expenses for an employee's additional night's lodging and additional day's meals over the weekend at a temporary business location after business was concluded are deductible business expenses. So this was a situation that I found myself in years ago when I was an auditor, and we were only permitted to fly home every 2 weeks. So what that meant is on Saturdays and Sundays, we just stayed in a hotel. And the bottom line is it was cheaper to stay in that hotel for 2 nights than to fly round trip back and forth. And so the IRS said, hey, that's okay. That makes sense, right? That makes good business sense. You can do that. So travel is always a facts and circumstances based test. There are very few bright line tests except for kind of that 1 year duration being temporary. So more on transportation away from home. If your spouse travels with you, you're going to need, I say pretty good, you're going to need a really good business reason to be able to deduct those costs. Like, this is an event that all spouses must attend kind of thing. Travel for education, extremely difficult. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. Mixed business and pleasure. And this is a situation where you're traveling for business and then you decide, oh, wow, I've not been here before. I think I'll stay and do some sightseeing and visit and do some other things. Well, now you've made your trip a mixed trip, right? There's part pleasure, part business. And what we're going to find is that the rules are going to differ if that is a domestic travel versus foreign travel, which is both of those are outside the U.S. All right, so let's start with domestic versus international. So domestic, if that trip is primarily for business, then it is 100% of that transportation is deductible. If it is not primarily for business, then 0% of that transportation will be deductible. So this is, again, we're dealing with travel, but we're dealing with the transportation part of the travel, which we traditionally think of as being airfare. So if I'm going to, well, let's see, probably have some examples. Meals, lodging, and incidentals remain deductible during the business days, right? Because those are still associated with business travel. If it's international, if it's primarily personal, then it is also 0% deductible. But if it's primarily business, then you are required to prorate the cost of that international transportation based on the business and personal percentages of each. There is a special international exception. If it's primarily for business and it's less than 1 week, then you're not required to prorate. Or if it's less than 25% personal, then you are not required to prorate. Let's keep rolling on our travel. As I mentioned, lodging, meals, incidentals, again, as long as they're related to business, they're deductible. In 2021 and 2022, restaurant meals were 100% deductible. All other meals are 50% deductible. 22 is technically behind us, not for our examples in the book, but now meals are largely back to 50% deductible. And that's the way of dealing, right? Because every meal has a personal component. We're generally eating because we're hungry. And so this is the Congress's way of dealing with the fact that, meal costs always have some sort of personal portion to them. Okay. So again, restrictions on transportation away from home, spousal travel is going to need a really good business reason. Travel for education is also difficult to deduct. So for example, I'm a French teacher. I'm going to France to practice my French, catch up on French culture. That's unlikely to be deductible. I'm a professor of French history. I'm going to Paris to examine some artifacts discovered after the fire at Notre Dame. That probably is deductible. To deduct convention costs, it must be directly related to an existing trade or business of the taxpayer. You must, of course, attend the convention. You can't just say you're attending it. For conventions outside of North America and on cruise ships, if a taxpayer attends a convention outside the North American continent, no business expense deduction is allowed unless the taxpayer can establish that 1, the convention is directly related to the active conduct of this trade or business, and 2, it is reasonable for the convention to be held outside of the North American continent. So one of the things I love is how we define the North American continent. So North American continent is a bunch of course, the U.S., Canada, Mexico, but it's also a bunch of Caribbean nations. It includes Micronesia, Marshall Islands, and Palau, and it also includes Guyana in South America, which I think is just fantastic, right? So I didn't realize we were able to redefine North America, but for the tax code, we definitely are able to do so. All right, and that brings us to the end of travel. We'll do some good in-class exercises on this one.